also like to express my thanks to Professor Ramaswamy for the invitation and the opportunity to give a talk here. When he said that it would be a special lecture, I thought I should speak about something, general rather than just my own research. And this is something that I've been sort of thinking about and engaged with in different capacity, but I haven't really talked about it. So I thought that this would be a chance to share some of this. And of course, this is a very controversial subject, and you tend to make more enemies than friends when you talk about this. But I think I'll go ahead. So what I will do is to just discuss some basics of GM, transgenics, the experience with GM worldwide a little bit, mainly two traits, herbicide tolerance and Bt toxin, Bt's HT and Bt, which are the two major traits that have been used worldwide. And then talk about GM in India, which comprises essentially GM cotton. What are the lessons that we can learn from our experience, what has from the experience of cotton here, and then sort of share some future perspectives based upon what I think are some of the things that have happened and where one might go in the future. Okay, so this is just basics of how transgenics are made. So the discovery of plant transformation in the early 80s really revolutionized plant biology and enabled the understanding of all physiological, developmental, and interactions with the environment, all of these processes at the molecular level. So it really transformed plant biology in a major way. And at the same time, it was recognized that this had enormous potential for crop biotechnology because you could bring in genes from other species, and that had a lot of potential. And very quickly, very soon after the discovery of plant transformation, which is by this agrobacterium, which carries a TI plasmid, which then, when it infects a plant cell, the part of the TI plasmid is transferred into the plant cell and integrates into the genome. And by putting genes into the relevant portion of the TI plasmid, you can insert genes into plants. Right? So this is the basis for plant transformation. Some general points about the nature of these insertion events that take place. Insertion of the tDNA, the transferred DNA, is generally at more or less at random locations in the plant genome. And these insertions are often multi-copy insertions and clustered together. And they are also associated with deletions and rearrangements of the host DNA where the insertion events have happened. More recently, of course, there is this new method that has arisen, genome editing. And genome editing is essentially a RNA-based search and cut machine. And by making these cuts of the DNA followed by non-homologous end joining, you can actually make mutations at specific sites. So you can make targeted changes in the DNA. And by actually modifying this machinery, you can also do homologous recombination. So that allows you to insert, direct, homology-directed DNA repair. So you can introduce specific DNA at the donor locus in a precise way. So now it becomes necessary to actually distinguish GM and transgenesis. Earlier, transgenesis was the insertion of GM was essentially equivalent to transgenesis, where you inserted some gene from somewhere else. Now you can actually do genetic modifications without any evidence of having inserted anything from outside. Now the usage of GM crops, this is slightly old, but the situation has not changed very much. There's about 181 million hectares worldwide under GM crops, and the four major GM crops are soybean, corn, canola, mustard, and cotton. And the major share of this is soybean. of which essentially, over 80% of the soybean grown worldwide is GM, and that's mostly herbicide tolerant. So the two major traits are herbicide tolerance and BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, and in India we have had BT cotton for starting in 2002. So I will talk a little bit about herbicide tolerance, HT technology. So HT is essentially the technology that simplifies weed management, and what it does is that the crop is genetically engineered to become resistant to a particular herbicide, and this allows the herbicide to be used in much larger amounts on the field, essentially replacing all other weed control measures and resulting in essentially quantitative killing of all the weeds, leaving only the engineered crop to grow, right? So it's very effective in large cropping systems like you have in the West, in the US, and even in South America, farms of hundreds or thousands of acres. In India, the farm size is small, so this can be used, but the necessity for this is and its impact is probably much less than what it is in the West. Now the question is, how does HT herbicide technology, herbicide resistance technology differ from conventional herbicide treatment, right? So this is an important point to understand over here. So conventional herbicide treatment generally involves treatment of the field or the seeds with limited amounts of different herbicides in combination, and that is because the seeds themselves are also somewhat can be sensitive to these herbicides. Okay. So you don't want to damage the seeds or the plant that the crop plant itself. Okay, and this conventional herbicide treatment is generally used as part of a set of practices to control weeds, right? Whereas herbicide tolerance technology, essentially by engineering the crop to become resistant, you can use much larger quantities of herbicides, which essentially kills off everything else, and it essentially replaces all other weed control measures, all other weed management practices. All right. Now, what it also does is that the issue is that over deployment of a single chemical method, and I emphasize the word single here, as in herbicide tolerance, that kills all the weeds, essentially everything else on the field except the engineered crop. This imposes very strong selection for the emergence and spread of resistant weeds. Okay. So once these emerge, they can spread very rapidly because there's no competition from other weeds. And this in turn leads to increased use of the herbicide, right? Now the most extensive trait that is used till now is glyphosate resistance. And glyphosate was actually is a really effective herbicide, and was used from in the 70s, starting in the 70s as a conventional herbicide. But after its incorporation into HT technology, about 5 years after that, you had essentially the emergence of glyphosate-resistant weeds. Whereas before that, there was really no reports on the occurrence of glyphosate-resistant weeds. So starting in 1996, which was when herbicide-resistant glyphosate resistance was first deployed, by 2002 or so, herbicide resistance had started to arise, and the use of these herbicides, so that essentially triggers using more herbicide to kill the weeds and so on and so forth. So after that, there was an increase in the use of herbicides, and this has continued pretty much every year after that. Okay. So this shows essentially the time of emergence of glyphosate-resistant weeds from the start of deployment of HT, which was in 1996 by about 2001 or so. So the problem here is that overuse of HT. So essentially, what they were doing was that they had engineered all the crops, all three crops, cotton, soybean, and corn, for resistance to glyphosate, because that was the herbicide resistance technology that worked the best. And even in their crop rotations, they were just using glyphosate-resistant plants, at continuously, more or less. All right, so that imposed extremely strong pressure, and overuse of this led to the emergence of these herbicide-resistant weeds within about 5 to 7 years, whereas prior to its use in the herbicide in the HT context, there really had been um, no reports of glyphosate resistance arising. In fact, it was thought that um, resistance to glyphosate is not possible, in this thing. But indeed, that was not the case. So what has emerged from this, mainly from experience in the US and South America, is that there's sort of broad agreement among weed science experts that, that a diversity of weed control methods is better than using a single method alone, right? And there's in fact a Weed Science Society of America that had in fact warned of this problem before HT was deployed. But the advantages of that was of HT was so attractive that it was essentially deployed, and Monsanto, the company that had a patent on glyphosate resistance, as well as for a time on glyphosate itself, made a lot of money, on this. Now, the problem of herbicide tolerance and the use of continuous use of one herbicide. So what happened after this is that once herbicide resistance arose, the proposal came from a number of many of these companies started developing stacked resistance. So they developed resistance to they engineered plants for resistance to more than one herbicide. And the idea here was that they would alternate treatments, and in this thing, and they made kind of theoretical arguments saying that by alternating treatments and selections, you would reduce the emergence of resistance growth. Except that that logic fails, because what is known is that weeds can arise that are resistant to multiple classes of herbicides. So you're not really looking at multiple events, but even single events can give rise to resistance to multiple herbicides. The latest report of the US National Academy of Sciences, as well as Engineering and Medicine on GM crops in 2016, recognizes this. So it makes the fairly cautious statement that on the basis of the committee's review of the theoretical and empirical literature, there is no scientific consensus on the best practices for delaying resistance simply through the use of mixtures of herbicides. And it also recognizes that there's a need for weed management that includes approaches other than continuous use of herbicides. So what happens with this is that once you get these herbicide-resistant weeds have really spread, very widely in the U.S. So within 5 years of their having arisen, they spread to about 20 million hectares in the U.S. And that number has been increasing every year in this thing, because essentially the use of HT technology continues in the US. So that's a summary of HT technology. What is BT? So BT essentially involves engineering plants to express an insecticidal protein from the soil bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis. And here you have a gene for this toxin which is inserted to express in the plant. And so the plant now produces this toxin itself. So if the insect eats this plant, then the toxin the protein gets in, it solubilizes, and by mechanisms which are not entirely clear, there's still controversy on the exact mechanism. One mechanism proposes that it actually punches holes into the membranes of the cells after assembling as an oligomer. Another is that it actually triggers a signal transduction pathway that leads to death of these intestinal cells, and both might be going on, if possible, right? So, but BT is supposed to be fairly specific to certain classes of insect pests. So it's not the toxicity is is not thought to extend to to animals and to higher animals and so on. Now coming to the experience in India, um, so India was, let me go through a bit of history over here first, because that's important to appreciate what, the context in which BT cotton came to India. So India was, um, around independence or so, the main, much of the cotton that was being grown was desi cotton. It was this Gossypium arboreum, which is actually an Indian Asian cotton, which is an Indian species. This produces this short staple, which is commercially less attractive. So there was a gradual shift to long staple cotton, which is the American cotton, Gossypium hirsutum. And gradually, India was also the first country to start using hybrid cotton, well before BT. So starting in the 1970s, and it's the only country that has been using BT cotton in the context of hybrids. Okay. All other countries, cotton growing countries, use BT as straight varieties. So varieties are true breeding, and the seeds essentially can be reused in each generation. With hybrids, the seeds can't be reused. You have to go back to the company to buy those hybrids, because the hybrids are made by crossing together two parents that are different from each other. Now, the need for BT cotton arose due to the emergence of the American bollworm, as a major pest of cotton in the late 1980s. And the term American bollworm is not because it came from America, but because it was observed as a pest of American cotton for the first time in India when American cotton was being grown in the late 1980s. And American bollworm became a pest because of the overuse of synthetic pyrethroid as pesticides, before that. So that's in the 70s and 80s, okay. And this was directed against two other pests of cotton primarily, the pink bollworm and a pest called the white fly. And this resulted essentially, those pests were controlled, but essentially the ecological imbalance of insects, the predator-prey sort of relationship was altered, and ABW essentially became resistant to this, and it became a major pest of cotton, whereas it wasn't a major pest of cotton before that. Now the use of BT cotton, so this came in in the late 80s and 90s, and BT cotton was seen essentially as the savior from the American bollworm, and it has been extremely effective in controlling the American bollworm for a number of years. Okay, and this has in fact been projected as leading to India becoming, the second largest producer of cotton in the world. Okay. More recently, within the last 3 years or so, the pink bollworm has now come back as being resistant to BT. So it has recently emerged again as a major pest of cotton. So coming to the question of why hybrids, why has India, what is the advantage of hybrids over here? So this is just as a picture of hybrids versus straight varieties, and hybrids have what is called hybrid vigor. So the plants, they are more vigorous, they are bigger, they have more vegetative growth, and they also produce more number of bolls. So you get somewhere between 40 to 100 bolls per plant in the case of hybrids, whereas in the case of straight varieties, you get around 20 to 30 bolls being produced. The plant types that have been used in India are both, in both cases, are these fairly broad types of plants, so that they produce more bolls, and we'll see why that is significant. Okay. Now, even though India is the second largest producer of cotton, and even though it is using these hybrids that produce more number of bolls, the actual productivity, that is the yield per unit area, you can see is much lower than it is for these other countries that have been using straight varieties. Even though hybrids were being used, so BT cotton started in 2002, although hybrids started before that, and you can see that there has been an increase around this time, in the yield or the productivity, I should say. And this has been ascribed to as being due to BT. But if you actually look at this graph, you can see that much of the initial increase, the major part of the increase happened when the proportion of land area under BT cotton was still quite small. It was around 6% or so. So the major increase in productivity in cotton actually can slightly preceded the large acceptance of BT cotton. So of course, when BT cotton started in 2002, it very quickly became accepted because of the protection that it offered against the American bollworm. So, but the increase in yield, the major part of it at least slightly preceded the increase in BT in the preceded BT cotton essentially. Over here. Now, why is it that the productivity is low in India? And this is because internationally in these countries, they've been using a different plant type, which is sort of a compact plant type that is planted out at much higher densities. So even though it's producing much fewer bolls, the number of these plants is about 10 times or more than the number of these than what is being planted out in India. So in internationally the figure is around 5 to 8 kilograms of seed per acre, whereas in India it's about 0.4 to 0.8 kilograms of seeds per acre. So yields here are about 1,000 to 2,000 kilograms per hectare, and in India it's around 500 kilograms per hectare or so. Now, hybrid seeds in the case of cotton are expensive because producing them essentially involves doing manual crosses, and because labor is cheap in India, you can produce it. But it's not economical to plant these out at higher densities. So comparing again, some parameters of hybrids versus varieties, the crop duration for hybrids in India is generally long. So these are all long duration crops, whereas in these countries the duration is considerably shorter. The flowering and the fruiting duration is also longer in India. In India, the plant density is much lower. The number of pickings of cotton is higher, so they go through about 3 to 5 rounds of picking because the production of these bolls takes place is not synchronous. It takes place as these branches grow, you get more number of bolls. So these are picked at different times. Whereas in these countries, it is mostly just a single picking that is done. This also means that the plant is more vulnerable in the long duration because it's more open to pest attack. It also requires more fertilizers. You can see that the fertilizer usage for hybrids is much higher than what it is for varieties. Okay, over here, and the water requirement is also greater and more. And that also introduces uncertainty, particularly in rain-fed areas, which is the major, most of the area, about 60%, 60 to 65% in India where cotton is grown is all rain-fed areas. So the late period is a risky one, and if there's no water, then you don't get the yields that you expect to get in this thing. So these risks, both inputs as well as pest attack, all of these things, the risks for this is considerably greater for these hybrid cotton. Now, the overall experience of HT and BT technologies, therefore, has been that both these technologies have been very effective for the first 5 to 10 years of usage, and it has even led to a reduction in the use of these chemical pesticides. But in both these cases, resistance has emerged primarily due to overusage, and this has been accompanied by increase in the use of pesticides to take care of to address the issue of resistance. And in the case of herbicide tolerance, these herbicide-resistant weeds are continuing to spread at a very high rate. So I should say in India also there is a demand among in certain areas for bringing in herbicide tolerant technology because farm labor is becoming more and more expensive or is not available and so on. So in the short run, it would certainly be attractive, but in the long run, the same sorts of problems, would likely arise. And in India, you have to keep in mind that we don't have any extra agricultural land, whereas in the US, you have, the, the the availability of land is much greater. So even if resistance arises, the only way to deal with it, if it gets to be really bad, is that the land has to lie fallow for some time, and then the weeds have to come back. The normal population of weeds has to be restored, and then you can start using it again. All right. But if you have herbicide tolerance arising in India, so then these weeds, herbicide-resistant weeds arising in India, that is likely to have be a more of have a much greater negative impact than it has probably had in the US. So BT cotton in India has been effective in the control of American bollworm, but now after about little over 10 years of usage, pink bollworm has re-emerged as a major pest. Okay. The second point is that the use of BT cotton has been in a suboptimal context as hybrids instead of compact varieties, and it's not clear to me still, why this has been persisted with for so long. Okay, it also has higher input costs, and it certainly propose, looking at the crop requirements and its vulnerabilities, it does pose an increased risk to farmers, particularly in rain-fed areas. All right, so that because due to uncertainty of water over long duration of the crop. Okay, and there's not been any data on this really because the studies have not been done. Although when BT cotton was approved, and even before that, there's not been any systematic examination of what the performance of BT has been relative to non-BT or to varieties and so on, right? And these studies would have been, important to have done. Of course, now everything is BT, so it's difficult to go back and get this information. It's not an unreasonable hypothesis to suppose that, to propose that the use of BT cotton as hybrids has increased, could be contributing to the, to distress, to the farmers' distress, especially among low resource farmers. Of course, the data for this is really not in. There's very limited information on this thing. All right, but this is based upon my understanding of the of the plant types and their properties. Furthermore, the use of hybrids, of BT in the context of hybrid technology has enabled retention of control of the seed, okay, by the seed company and the charging of very high royalties. So the lessons from this, the one thing is to take away is that the context of application of a technology really determines the outcome. It's not just the technology itself. You could have used, if you had used BT cotton just as varieties, you could. Many countries are continuing to use cotton without BT, and they still get higher yields than we are getting with BT in the context of hybrids. All right. The other important thing to consider, I think, factor is that there should have been really a broad suitability of GM cotton across all the cross section of farmers, right? When it was deployed, right, in the hybrid. So, whereas the use of BT as hybrids if you're a resource-rich farmer who has access to irrigation and everything else, you have far less risk. But for farmers in rain-fed, particularly marginal areas, the risk is greater, right? So when considering the regulation and the regulatory approval of GM crops or products, I think in the case of cotton at least, it was missed um, looking at the suitability of the product across all cross sections of farmers. All right. Again, the data for this is not clear. At the time that the approval was given, these studies were supposed to have been done in the course of time. Okay. But they were never done, and there was no real mechanism or will to follow up on this thing. So it was not done. The other sort of issue is also, which is kind of uh, ironic, is that there's a very high cost and time for development and clearance and regulatory clearance of GM products, all right? And so this favors developers with deep pockets, and once they spend all of this money, the pressure, the tendency is to get as much of it back as quickly as possible. And so this leads to overuse and monoculture, and breakdown of the technology and unsustainability over a period of time. So this is an issue. This is an issue not just with BT cotton, but it may be an issue with other GM crops as well, as and when they come. So these are just some perspectives on future GM in India. One is, I feel, for this an opinion, is that excessive reliance on technological solutions, including GM, to solve agriculture problems, ignoring wider underlying issues, can actually distort policy. And in India, particularly, reducing risk to farmers, which would include lowering input costs, infrastructure, and increasing farmer incomes. There's a wide gap right now between minimum support price in theory and practice, and we all are aware of this. And these are the things that need sort of greater attention. And all of this has been covered in the Swaminathan Commission report in 2006, but the implementation is still far away, the real implementation. Another point is that the major problems that we are likely to face, such as climate change and reduced groundwater availability, these pose complex challenges. So it's likely that you're going to need a variety of approaches and not just a single technology to be able to address these major challenges. The third point that I just want to mention kind of in passing is that alteration of endogenous plant genes by methods such as CRISPR and introduction of modified plant genes into plants, what is called cisgenics, these reduce some of the safety concerns that have been there with regard to transgenics in the future. But if they are used in the future, these will, it will still require rigorous testing. The fourth issue is, the general issue of long-term sustainability versus short-term gains. And this is very hard to, I think, as the more desperate farmers become, the more they care about short-term gains, and they're not really too interested in long-term sustainability. But for the regulatory process to actually, needs to be the one that actually takes some of this thing into account. Okay. And probably combinatorial practices for pest and weed control are likely to be more sustainable than single point solutions that come with fairly high environmental costs as well. In India, there's a demand for HT due to labor shortages. Again, here short term versus long term is an issue, and there's a high cost of GM development and the right to farmers to save seeds, which is there in the Indian Seed Act. It should be pointed out that in other countries where BT cotton is being used, even BT soybean, GM soybean, farmers have to sign an agreement not to reuse their seeds. They have to buy it every time from the company. In India, that is not the case because of the Indian Seed Act, which guarantees the right to reuse saved seeds. The third issue also which has happened which is emerging, is the detection of contamination and illegal GM, right? So there have been a number of reports going back some time. This year, there have also been reports these reports have been there on illegal HT cotton, in the past also on illegal BT cotton. And the mechanisms for deterrence and enforcement are really very limited. These need to be strengthened, for this. So these are some of the issues. So I'll stop there. Thank you.